Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. If you haven't told your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, make it your holiday present to me. Go out of your way when you get a chance. Well, don't go really out of your way. I'm just saying that to be funny. And tell some of your friends about it. You know, tell them at the club or online or wherever, and tell your friends about it. I appreciate it. Okay, I promised in the last video that we would have a couple of instructive amateur games during the holiday here. And this is the second one, and it's got a lot of interesting points during the game, but the most interesting points are at the end when one of the players follows a very strange idea, which is if your opponent wants to trade queens, then you absolutely positively should not trade queens. Well, that's not true for two reasons. One, your opponent might be a weak player, and if he wants to trade queens, maybe it's not good for him. Or two, maybe he's a strong player and he offers to trade queens, and maybe trading queens is bad for you. But if you don't trade queens, it's even worse for you, which means you should trade queens. A lot of people miss that logic. They figure if something's bad for you, the alternative must be what's good for you. Well, that's not true in chess. It's not a zero-sum game. If something's bad for you, it may be the alternative is even worse. It's sort of like saying, you can give me a quarter, you can give me $1 billion. And you say, well, gee, give you a quarter, that's not good for me. I'd lose a quarter for nothing. I'll just take the second alternative, whatever it is. And the second alternative is to give me the $1 billion. Doesn't make sense with money, doesn't make sense in chess. All right, let's take a look at the game. My student was black, so we'll look at it from his point of view. His opponent opened up d4, he plays knight f6, and white plays knight f3. And now black can do all kinds of things. He could offer some sort of King's Indian or Grunfeld with g6. He can play e6 and go for a Queen's Indian or a Bogo Indian or something like that, which he does. And now white would normally play c4 here. White plays c3. Well, that's a pretty passive move. It's not terrible. You know, it doesn't do anything terrible. It just doesn't really fight for the d5 square. And now black could just set up a normal type of game with d5 and c5 and knight c6 or bishop e7 or bishop d6 castle kingside. Black does play d5. White plays knight bd2. So white could be setting up a delayed Cole system with e3 and bishop d3. Black usually plays something like c5 here to pressure the center, and he does. Very good. Thank you, student, for showing that. Queen to c2. If people play queen c2, maybe at some point here, black can take this pawn. If black takes back with the knight, white gets a 2-pawn to 1 center advantage. And if white takes back with the pawn, he could stick a rook on c8 and harass the queen. So it's not a ridiculous move here to play c takes d4 already and then get ready to castle kingside and put a rook on the c-file. And you could see the engine agrees with me. The engine already says that black is better by 6/10 of a pawn if he does that. All right, black plays bishop e7. The only problem with waiting one move is white can play e3, and then when you take the pawn, he captures with the e-pawn, keeping his queen protected and also opening up the line for the bishop. So waiting a move is actually throws away some of that advantage. And you can see it now says the white's only up by 1/10 of a pawn. All right, so white does play e3, black castles, white plays bishop here. Now, in these kind of positions, you have several ways to develop the queen bishop. One way is to play b6 and then bishop a6 right away while the knight's still on b8 to guard the bishop. For instance, pawn here, castle, bishop here, pinning the bishop to the rook, and notice you have pawns on the light squares, so you're trading off your light squared bishop and getting it off the board so that your only bishop left is your better dark squared bishop. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to play the bishop to b7. Let's do that line again. And then when white does something, you can stick a knight in here where the bishop is helping guard the knight so that knight takes knight doesn't win material anymore, and you can see black still retains his 2/10 of a pawn advantage. So those are the kind of the two main ways of doing it. If you first bring out your queen knight, then you can't play bishop a6, and then you're stuck more with the bishop b7. But even then, knight c6 not being a bad move, of course, it's tied for the best move. Even then, the knight on c6 would block the bishop if it goes to b7. Not a big deal, really. All right, so black does play b6 first, very accurate. White castles, and now the engine says between bishop a6 and bishop b7, if you can see, those are the two top moves. Now queen c7 has snuck in as number 2. Knight c6, number 2. It likes bishop b7 just slightly better here. And my student played the best move, bishop b7. White plays rook e1, getting ready to maybe move the bishop, which usually belongs on d3 in this kind of structure, and then play e4. Black develops the knight. As I said, putting the knight on that square doesn't support the bishop stopping e4 anymore. So the engine prefers either h6, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but okay, or knight bd7. Now, you hate to have these redundant knights. Grandmaster Kaufman calls two knights that guard each other redundant if they're not doing it for tactical reasons. And here they're not, but it also doesn't block the bishop, so the engine likes that better. All right, black plays knight c6, white plays knight f1, rook c8. There's that rook on the same line with the queen, getting ready maybe for some sneaky pin action. And now white does something that you should probably do when a rook gets on the same line with your queen. Get your queen out of there. The engine says you don't have to do it right away. He does. The problem is he moves it to a square where he blocks the queen bishop. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And also now, if pawn takes pawn, he can't play c takes because of bishop b4 skewering the queen and the rook. If you haven't seen my earlier video on the geometry of chess tactics, there's one right there. All right, so black does take, and we just said white can't take with the c-pawn, but he really doesn't want to anyway. That would not only open up the rook, but it would keep the bishop blocked. So there's every reason in the world to take with the e-pawn and not the c-pawn. And if you look at the engine evaluation, it says taking with the e-pawn is like an entire pawn better. Partly because, of course, you can't take with the c-pawn, so your only alternative is to really take with the knight, and that leaves black with more center pawns in a really good position. All right, so white plays the best move, e takes. Still black's better here. Now he should play knight e4, hit the queen. If he wasn't hitting the queen, knight e4 wouldn't be that big a deal because it would spend a tempo you could use to develop your queen and your other rook. But in this position, you're hitting the queen, and maybe you could push the f-pawn and develop the rook that way. So there's good possibilities of doing that. In fact, the engine says if you do play knight e4, following that up in a couple moves with f5 would actually make some sense. I can see that in the top line. All right, so rook e8. You know, is the rook really better on e8 than it is on f8? Only if you're going to break with e5, but if you break with e5 and he trades pawns, that'll leave you with an isolated d-pawn and you won't have much to show for it. So I'm not sure moving the rook to e8 is better. I have a principle. I don't have a principle. Everybody's had this principle. There's a principle, move every piece once before you move any piece twice unless there's a tactic. But the idea of that principle is to activate all your pieces, and it's not clear that the rook is more active on e8 than f8. And if it's not clear it's more active, then you don't want to move a piece just to check off a box and say you moved a piece. You want to move a piece because it's better where it is. All right, the engine says rook e8 is not one of the top 3 moves. And it says now white has a slight advantage. White plays bishop d3. Black starts to worry about that attack on h7, and he plays h6. He really doesn't need to do that. It actually creates a little bit of a target. Right now it says if black plays his best moves, which are like bishop d6 or knight e4, knight e4 is a little bit hard to see because it's attacked twice and it's only guarded once. So you'd have to figure out some sort of tactical way why you can do that. It's called tactical justification. But we won't get into that. But we will say that you really don't want to play a move like h6 and weaken your king side unless there's some sort of threat that you really have to meet. So he does, and the engine says he drops about a half a pawn in evaluation from close to even to about 0.5. Now white should get his queen out of the way of the bishop maybe. The engine suggests queen e2 does that. It says the best move is knight e5. White does get the queen out of the way, plays it back to d1. We give him credit for putting the queen back in the original square. A lot of people hate to do that. We won't give him as much credit since in this particular case, it's really not the best square for the queen. Black finally develops his queen. White gets that knight off the first rank. Black moves his bishop up. Engine says white should block that diagonal now with g3, even though it weakens the white squares around his king. Notice if white does play g3 and weaken the white squares, he can get a bishop back to f1 and guard them if he needs to, And this bishop doesn't have any great way of getting around these pawns to attack those squares. So g3 is not very weakening here. All right, the knight goes back to f1, overprotecting h2. He really didn't have to overprotect it. He already had a knight on f3 and a king on g1 guarding it. And black decides to break in the center now with e5, even though it gives him the isolated pawn. And the engine says, that's not a good move. The engine again wants to play here, but you know that loses a pawn. Let's look at it this time and see why it really doesn't lose a pawn. Let's say he tries to take the pawn. With rook takes, engine says, get a discovered attack on the rook. Let's say the rook goes back and guards the knight so he doesn't double his pawns. Knight to g6. See, this is the kind of position where most players, including myself to some extent, would say, yeah, this is very nice. My bishops are really good, but he has a healthy extra pawn, and it's really not worth a whole healthy extra pawn. And this is where the engine is, 1,000 points better than me and says, oh, you couldn't be more wrong, Dan. Yes, it is. Black's not only has compensation for the pawn, he's actually up a pawn in evaluation. So black has, instead of just having the bishop pair for the pawn, which would be half a pawn, black's actually got 2 pawns of compensation, which is really, really a lot. All right, let's go back to the game. So in the game, black plays the dangerous move e5. Well, that justifies his rook e8 move, but it does give him an isolated e-pawn. The engine says if he plays it right, he should be equal, but if he had played the best move instead, he would have the 0.7 advantage. So e5, of course, white's going to isolate that pawn. In this position, white has no choice. Black's threatening e4. It would be a big mistake to allow black to play e4 here, not because it forks. Let's say you move the bishop, so there's no fork. And now black plays here, and now you move the knight, let's say knight to d2. Well, this is terrible. First of all, you're losing a pawn because sneaky pin, knight takes d4, wins a pawn. But even so, even if the knight had gone somewhere else where, let's say the knight goes to h4, like that, this position is now minus 1.5 pawns for black. Black's pieces are all really good. He's got more space. White's pieces are all very passively placed. So you pretty much, when somebody breaks like that in the center, you almost have to take. And the engine says taking with the knight or the pawn, the 2 safe moves, are at least half a pawn better than the 3rd best move. All right, so white takes, black takes, white takes, black takes, and white plays bishop e3. And the engine says black's advantage is gone now. Black has a lot of mobility with his army. He's got a lot of activity, but he's got an isolated pawn and he doesn't have much to show for it. His pieces are a little more active, and that's why the position is even. Now the engine says 0.1, but that's basically even. So black's plays his best move, queen d7. White plays bishop to d4, which is an interesting move because he's offering to get his own isolated pawn here just to get rid of the active black pieces. So black says, sure, I'll isolate your pawn too. That's his best move. And now the game looks very equal with 2 open lines where the rooks can be traded. Each side has a knight and a bishop. Basically, everybody's got the same things. White has a slight better bishop. The center pawn for white is on the opposite color of his bishop. The center pawn for black is not. Is that a big deal? Well, if there was only if they were the only pieces on the board, it would be a bigger deal. But in this particular position with the other pieces, it's not as big a deal. So the engine says 0-0. All right, rook takes e1. Queen has to take. He hits the queen, taking the other open file. Computer says white should play queen b4 here with a slight advantage. Plays knight e3. Still around equal. Black says, let me hit that knight over there. Well, that looks very noble that you're hitting the pinned knight. The problem is white has a tactic now. This is exactly what we were talking about earlier in the video where I was referring to my other video of the geometry of chess tactics. Well, we've got a knight and a queen, both unprotected, both on the same diagonal. What piece might be the one to hurt it? It could be a bishop. And now you have to do a little counting. Suppose the bishop goes to f5. Now we have to count different ways to play this. One way would be to just take the bishop, because the knight's pinned, and when the knight takes, take the queen, and then when the rook takes and the smoke clears, who's ahead? Well, if we go back and count, we're giving up a queen for a bishop, and then to win his queen, we have to give up a rook. So we end up losing the exchange, losing a rook for a bishop. So that doesn't work. Or we could remove the guard with rook takes e3, hitting the queen. And then when the bishop takes the queen, the rook can take and the rook can take back. And again, we're sacrificing the exchange in order to save the queen, but we end up down the exchange at the end. So no matter how black plays this, if he just moves the queen, then he's going to lose the knight for nothing with bishop takes g4. If he takes the bishop with the queen, the pinned knight will move, and even though the queen gets taken with check, you end up winning the exchange. And finally, if you sack the rook here, you play rook takes, he'll take your queen. Notice the queen wasn't guarded, so when he takes check and he takes back, there's nothing to retake the bishop here, and black remains down the exchange in this sequence. So the seeds of tactical destruction here of the queen and the knight on the same line should cause a loss of the game. And white should see this. He should do those calculations that we just did. If you don't do the calculations, you can't see it. Now, I always say you can't play what you don't see. Maybe he didn't see bishop f5 at all, or maybe he thought bishop f5 didn't work. But bishop f5 does work. Suppose you look at bishop f5 and it looks like it doesn't work because the knight's pinned. Then you want to spend some more time, because if it does work, you're winning the whole game. Anytime you have a critical move where you could win the whole game and it looks like it doesn't work at first, take a little more time and see if you can, quote, make it work, unquote. Because making it work will win you the game, and it's worth a little extra time on your clock. So here, if you see bishop f5 and you think it doesn't work, spend a little more time on it. If you don't see bishop f5 at all, then you're not looking for these geometric patterns that give you possible tactics. All right, so we've got an instructive learning point here in the game. So white misses it and plays queen d2, and all of a sudden he goes from up 7 pawns to down 0.3. So it's a double blunder. Black blundered by playing knight g4, attacking the knight on e3, and white blundered by not taking advantage of it and playing bishop f5, winning. So now black decides to take on e3, which gives white a backward pawn on the e file. A backward pawn is one if you take all the take all the pieces off the board. It's a pawn that can move, but if it moves, it would lose material to the opposing pawns. So that's considered a backward pawn, which is generally the weakest type of bad pawn. Slightly weaker than an isolated pawn, and usually weaker than doubled pawns. All right, black starts to pile up on that pawn. Notice the pawn is the opposite color of his bishop, so he can only get 2 pieces attacking that pawn, and white can easily get 3 pieces, a queen, a king, and a rook guarding the pawn. And there's no way to win that pawn, but at least you could tie him up. That pawn can't come up and trade off because the black's got 4 pieces guarding the e4 square. So white plays rook there, and there's no real way to increase the pressure to the point that you're going to win the game here. You just have to kind of sit on him. Black plays the kind of strange move queen there. Well, that does pin the e pawn. He can't move because you take his queen, but he wasn't going to move it anyway. So white plays his best move, queen f2. Engine says 0-0 again. Black decides his bishop wasn't doing very much on b7 and plays back. Now, if white wants to, he could push the e-pawn and get rid of his backward pawn and instead get an isolated pass pawn, which is probably a good deal. So the bishop on b7 was doing something. White plays h4. That doesn't really weaken the king that much. But on the other hand, it doesn't do that much offensively either. It does get rid of back rank mates, but without the f-pawn on the board, there wasn't much threat of back rank mates. So it's kind of a neutral move. Black moves the queen back. White hits the rook. Black offers the trade of bishops. Now here we're going to see something that's a theme for the rest of the game, which is every time black offers a trade, white turns it down. White's under the impression that if your opponent wants to trade, it must be bad for you, and so therefore moving away must be good for him. Sometimes you're going to be right, sometimes you're going to be wrong if you do that, but that logic is not good. Sometimes when your opponent offers a trade, yes, it might be good for him, but you have nothing better. Or it might actually be terrible for him, in which case you should definitely trade, but you can't just use the logic, if he wants to trade, I won't trade. And we're going to see that again and again and again for the rest of the game. So white moves back. Now black could stop e4 with bishop c6 because his queen's in front of his rook, or he can move the queen. He plays queen d6, but now white can still play e4, which he doesn't have to, but he can. Computer says he shouldn't. He should just do nothing and get a draw. White plays there. For the same reason we talked about earlier in the game, black pretty much has to take that pawn. If you don't realize that, you might want to go back to the earlier part of the game where I was discussing what happens if you ignore these things and just let those pawns come marching down the board. So you take, that's the correct move. Black's better by a small amount here. Notice white can't play bishop takes because f5 would cause some problems with the d pawn. If you don't see that, let's do that. And now the queen is overworked. He can't recapture the rook and guard the d pawn. But the more important is to capture the rook. And now he loses the pawn with check, and he's losing the game. So that's the reason white can't take with the rook. Can't take with the bishop. He has to take with the rook. If he takes with the rook, then there's no rook to have to guard on e1, and therefore he's not losing the pawn. Okay, so now white has an isolated pawn, but it's also a pass pawn, which is good and bad. If that pawn can get rolling, it could be dangerous. If it doesn't get rolling, it could be a target. So it can be both a good pawn and a bad pawn at the same time, in a sense. All right, now black could try to blockade that pawn. There's not enough material now for white on the board to checkmate the king unless black does something terribly wrong. So at this point, you might start to think about making your king one of those pieces that could help stop the pawn. All right, queen f4. And now black should play something like g6 just to give his king luft so that on queen checks he has a nice square to go to. Black instead gives his king luft, but he weakens a lot of squares around his king. By playing f5, he weakens f7, g6, and h7, and those are all white squares, and there's a light squared bishop on the board. So you have to be a little careful. The engine says he's still okay. Bishop f3. a5. Well, correctly, black puts his pawns on the opposite color of the bishops, but it really doesn't help him that much to play a5. He doesn't have a majority or anything going there, so it doesn't hurt him. It doesn't help him that much. White plays b3, but that's the white squares, so maybe if we get into a bishop of the same color endgame, this would be good for black. Black checks, king h2. Now, queen to d6, threatening the bishop and the pawn is an idea, so black should bring his queen back to stop queen d6. He plays it too far back, creates a battery with the bishop that really doesn't do anything. I can take that arrow off the board. Now the engine says if white plays bishop d5 check, that white has some advantage. He plays queen c7, hitting the b pawn. Black guards it with queen e6. And white says, oh good, I finally get a chance to move my pawn a little down the board. Now the engine says queen e1, threatening queen takes h4 check is the only move to really get equality. Black plays queen e7. Now the engine says if white plays g3, he has a nice little advantage. He plays queen f4. White gets the king into the game. Still back to 0-0. Queen d4, hitting that b pawn again. Engine says that black should play queen to b4 after queen to d4 here. And that would give white some problems. The trade of queens would make the a pawn backward. So let's take a look at that. Queen b4. If you say, oh, I'm going to double and isolate his pawns, well, that's true. You are doubling and isolating his pawns, but you're creating a backward pawn here. And not only that, the black king can play king to f6 and then king to e5 here. For instance, king g3. He could play g5 here. Probably g5 is the most accurate to keep the king out. And now white tries to come around and black will come up. If white wants to, he could take the pawn first. Black's not going to take that pawn, but let's say white takes. And then goes here, and black goes here. White goes here, black goes here. And now black's simply threatening to attack that pawn with his bishop and win it. And there's not much he can do. If he plays king d3, we can check him back away. We could play g4 and remove the guard of the bishop on this pawn. For instance, g4, bishop e2, bishop checks to drive him backward, king e3, check to drive him backward. Finally, he goes back. We trade bishops. We take off his pawn, and we win this endgame easily. Notice how these two isolated pawns hold up the non-isolated pawns very nicely, and we have a nice 2-on-1 majority on the other side. All right, back to the game. So after queen d4, black played queen c5, and now we're going to see that theme again, where no matter how good it is for white to trade queens, and in this position it's not that good, he doesn't do it. So queen e5, queen e7, loses the game. The engine says queen f2 would draw, queen b4 would draw. The problem with queen e7 is after bishop checks, king back, queen checks, if you put the bishop in the way, white will just trade everything off. Queen takes, bishop takes, king takes. And now the winning move is h5 to make this pawn backward and allow the king to come up. And now if black tries to win the d pawn, white will go ahead and win this pawn. And now white's going to win the g pawn too, thanks to that move h5. And white will win this race. If black tries to get the pawns on the queen side, it's too slow. And he can't come back and defend on the king side. All right, back to the game. Well, we've already seen if black offers trades, white's going to say no, just on general principles, even though there is no such general principle. So he takes with the bishop, and black says, all right, I got to take with the queen. And white says, all right, well, if you're taking with the queen, even though I forced it, I'm not going to trade queens. And the engine says, but that's the only way to win the game is to trade queens and win that endgame. Now, he may have been short on time and couldn't figure this out. We understand. But we'll see in a couple moves that it gets even worse. So he checks, and black puts the queen away. And now trading queens is bad for white, because now the black king is one square closer to the d pawn. And white can't win the same way. So white moves his queen back. And now black makes a big, big mistake. He plays queen to e4. But now the trade of queens is good for white, because when white trades queens and he brings his king up to win this pawn, either the pawn's going to waste tempos going up the board, which doesn't do anything, or when the king takes the pawn, he's going to be guarding his pawn and he wins the game. Up a clear pawn. If you don't know how to win this endgame, go back to my video, King and 5 pawns against King and 4. So black's moves queen e4 just completely loses the game. White can just trade and win, but we've already seen white's using the principle that doesn't exist, which is if your opponent offers a trade of something, don't trade. Well, here, trading wins the game. It's the only move to win the game is to take the queen. Every other move is either a draw or worse. He plays check, and the engine says, what are you doing? You just missed it. And black says, how about trading queens? And white says, well, you know I won't do that. So he plays queen b8, king f7, queen f4, king up. Now the king can become very active. Now playing g5 becomes an idea. A check, well, now black's going to offer a trade of queens, make an offer that cannot be refused. He's going to fork the queen and the king, and now when the queens are traded, he's going to win the d pawn and still retain his f pawn, and therefore he'll be the one with 5 against 4. And now black's winning. White tries to bring his king up. Black plays his pawn up 1. Well, that keeps the king out, so that'll win. Probably a little more accurate was to move it up 2, but the engine says they both win. But black has the right idea. He wants to stop the white king from coming in while he gets the pawn. So he can do that with g6 or g5. He plays g6. The problem with g6 is in some lines white can play h5, but it doesn't work. White pushes the pawn. That's just a waste. Black takes. White comes up. Black goes there. Now if white pushes the pawn, because the black king's guarding this pawn, he can play check, and white can't play king takes f5, so that trick doesn't work, and the game's about to be over with Zugzwang. a4. Black correctly says, I'm going to play g5 check. White goes back. Black brings his king up. White keeps getting into Zugzwang here. Again, if you don't know how to do this, I have a whole video on this called King and 5 Pawns against King and 4. It goes into this kind of endgame in gory detail. White goes there. Black says, let me get my majority rolling. White says, let's trade pawns. Black says, good, I've got my pawns guarding all these squares. He starts to go after the pawns on the other side, and white realizes this is hopeless. If his king does nothing, the black king will just pick up all these pawns. If he pushes the g-pawn, black has two ways to win. He could take the pawn and then go after these pawns, or he could get a protected passed pawn. And when white sits there and waits, go after this pawn. And when he takes, and if white ever goes here, he'll go here and get a queen way first anyway. So it's completely hopeless. And in this position, after king d4, white resigned. All right, we're a little longer than some of our normal videos, but there was a lot of good teaching points. Please, again, not as important as liking or subscribing is telling your friends about the channel. But if you want to like the video, I like that. If you want to subscribe, I like that too. Thanks for your support, and hopefully this game was instructive and will help you in the future. See you next time. Happy holidays. Bye.